welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the event, How Machine Learning is Transforming the Financial Services Industry. So my name is Kushali Ganatalaka and I head partnerships and community at BOAB AI, and I'll be moderating the session this afternoon. So for those of you who are unaware of who we are at BOAB, we're backed by Artesian and we're supported by LaunchVic. And what we do is we run a scale-up investment program, and it's based in Melbourne, but we take companies and invest in companies in Victoria, interstate and internationally, that are artificial intelligence scale-up companies that are ready to expand globally. So that's just a bit about what we do at BOAB. But I'd like to start this session off. And before we do begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this event takes place from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional owners right across our country. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend this acknowledgement and respect to others right across our nation, on the nations whose land we meet from, wherever we are calling in from today. So I'd like to start today by talking about how machine learning can be leveraged in the financial services industry. And we'll also discuss what the impact it has and will have on the industry, and why the time is actually now for a machine learning driven shift for the sector. So to discuss this, we have some fantastic panel members joining us today, and I'd like to introduce each of them to you. So we've got Kendra Vant. Welcome, Kendra. So Kendra is the Executive GM of Data, AI and ML at Xero. So I know most of you will know who Xero are. So they're a cloud-based accounting software platform for small businesses with over 2.7 subscribers globally. And we've also got Richard Everett. Welcome, Richard. So Richard is the Head of Business Development at PI Exchange, and PI Exchange are a deep tech company that developed the AI and analytics engine, and it's an accessible end-to-end data science and machine learning platform that simplifies and accelerates building value with the power of AI and ML. We also did have Siobhan Casey, who was joining us, and Siobhan is the Director of Scale-Ups and Innovation Labs at the Australian Computer Society, ACS, but she was unfortunately unable to join because she was feeling a little under the weather, so we do wish her a very speedy recovery. So welcome, Kendra and Richard. It's wonderful to have you both. So what we'll do is, to start off, we're seeing and hearing, Kendra and Richard, about how AI and ML is changing the landscape of the financial services industry. What have you both seen as some of the most high value applications of AI and ML in this sector? And maybe we'll start with you, Kendra, on that.
Sure, let's see if I can make the tech work. So thanks so much for having us. It's lovely to be here. And yeah, as you say, Siobhan, I hope she feels better really soon. That was such a challenge to lose her. I guess I look at this a little more broadly. I've been working in and around FSI for quite a long time. And for me, high value is very much in the hands of the company. Where I would suggest people start if they want to identify, like for us, what might be high value is, I start to look for any place that you can remove manual toil. So any place where you can go to a human and find the things that humans find boring and repetitive and just, not particularly engaging, that's a really great place to start looking. Why? Because I think those are places where you can take expensive human resources out of the system and replace them with hopefully somewhat less expensive ML resources. Why do I say somewhat less expensive? I do think, and this is for me a little bit of a trap for young players thing for folks who are thinking of really leaning in more to this space. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer in the sort of perhaps the business press side of ML, is that it's really cheap because you replace humans with machine learning. If you can replace humans with machine learning, and sometimes you can, I often like to think about where can I augment them, perhaps rather than when I can replace them. The software you're building is actually really expensive software. So it's a very roundabout answer to your question. I do apologize for that, but I think it's important because I think high value is really with that entrepreneur who has the brilliant idea, or the person who's toiled for a long time in a process deep space and they're like, I just know that I could automate some of this away. That's going to lead you towards what's high value. And then the trick for figuring out whether it's a high value application of machine learning is effectively, the way I always go is, can one human come to an answer in a couple of seconds? Would 5 humans agree on the same answer? And do I have lots of previous versions of that answer? If you say yes, 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 I reckon that's a pretty good place to go. You've said it's high value as an entrepreneur or a business leader, and that's a space ripe for augmentation of humans with machine learning, and go into it that way. Just because of this challenge of machine learning is not cheap. It's cheaper than humans if you're doing something at enough scale, but it's not cheap software to build. So that sort of, I guess, lessons learned for myself over the last 10 years, and keen to pay that forward to other folk who might be sort of thinking about getting into the space.
Wonderful. And Richard, I saw that you were nodding in a few spots there. Would you like to add some stuff there too?
Yeah, I actually agree with Kendra's point, and I look at it that if you look at the high impact areas at the moment, it has been around augmentation of deep skill sets. You're not going to be able to replace high value humans when you've got significant matters of regulation, of legal compliance, of banking compliance, and an operational process from a transactional perspective. So if you look at insto banking, or you're looking at any of those type of services that are offered, there is always checks and balances in place, and there is always a position that comes down to approval from a manual interventions perspective. It's the law. So I'll give you an example where I would see this, and a project that we're involved in Asia at the moment, which is around anti-money laundering. There's a lot of work that's been done over the years, and there's fantastic systems that are out there. But in anti-money laundering, there is it's an incredibly I'm going to use the term hydraulic process, right? So you've got a lot of paperwork that has to be done. You've got reporting, you've got your regulatory compliance, you've got your laws, you've got transaction flow, you've got KYC, you've got all those factors that actually go into the transaction of AML. Now, what we have been able to do is to go through a level of automation of the legislation, go through a level of automation of the reporting, assisting institutions in terms of, as an example, false positives. It takes an enormous amount of resource to actually go through a transaction flow. It says, there might be a flag in the system on a transaction that says, hey, this may be suspect. It may not, but 99% of the time, it's a false positive and just has to be disregarded. And as a result of that, they're the sorts of things that Kendra just touched on, where you don't need a human to touch that. You don't need a high value individual. And these people are specialists, particularly the example of the AML space. You don't need a high value individual like this with years and years of experience, with years and years of capability wrapped around them, to go and to be doing manual and administrative tasks. And that's where I think you see the high impact of it. I think then you take the extension of that, which is where I think some of the other pieces, because of the volume of data, is coming into volumetric prediction and looking at what does payments look like, what does transactions look like, what do trends look like. So there's potentially benefit for the bank in terms of trend, in terms of customer, in terms of customer experience, in terms of marketing, in terms of product, those sorts of things that are going to come in the sector. And we're seeing practical cases of this at the moment. What'll be interesting is, as we get through the conversation today, is to see what the emerging looks like in the next technologies.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I think those are really great points that you both made there. And thank you for that. So now, scaling AI and ML technologies in the financial service industry can be quite difficult. And many financial service providers struggle to move from that experimentation around select use cases to then scaling the AI technologies across the organization. Richard, what would you say are the biggest challenges in the financial service providers to be able to do this? So from scaling from that use case.
Sure. So there's a couple of key pieces. So we're all familiar with the Royal Commission that's gone through regulatory tightening, expectations that are placed on institutions in terms of people, process, and regulation. And the available technologies, if you actually look at it, most of the technologies and process that exist in a bank are rusted on. They've been around for a long time. The systems that are legacy, and to drive scale is to see, well, what happens within the banking environment, the availability of technology, the availability of resources, the availability of capability, and then how do you actually start to transition that? How do you actually modernize that? Because a bank is going to look at this as a direct example. If you had an environment where you've got you look to fintech and you look to what happens within the banking environment, everyone's looking at payments. Everyone's looking at acquire trades, all those type of, the core banking platform. And there's great offerings that are out there at the moment. But what happens when this becomes mainstream? And how does this then become a competitive advantage, and where they start to uptake a number of these players in the marketplace? So that all of a sudden becomes a standard offering. And the challenge therefore is, how does the bank differentiate? How does the bank use that, the existing bank? How do they use that and differentiate? And then back to the fintech, how are they actually able to evolve? Because as their products and offerings become commodity and commonplace, it's very difficult then to differentiate. So I think what happens here is that it's not just about modernization. It's not just about that transformation and process and alike. It then becomes about, how are they disrupting? What are they doing to disrupt? Is there something that can be done within a regulatory framework? Because there's always going to be those pressures that actually present to it. And do the regulators keep up from a modern technology and from a disruption perspective? And then what does that look like to get to the next stage? I think there's a very significant piece as well that banks have to cope with, which is around existing contracts, existing service delivery, existing equipment and process. So there are many factors that come into it. And I think really important out of this is that one of the key inhibitors for us, I think, is that the adoption of AI is the maturity and the capability and the resourcing that's available out there. It is a genuine obstacle. And I think that's where we're seeing in the marketplace our ability to get traction as we do, is that we're augmenting that capability to the banks as a service.
Yeah, and Kendra, it'll be great to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so let me take a different dimension on it, because a lot of what Richard's saying, I think, is spot on and interestingly specific to financial services, where we are a heavily regulated industry. Maybe an equally important dimension to why companies struggle to get out of experimentation and into scale and into real products, I think. And this is really borne out in conversations that I have as Xero grows, as we hire, with a lot of people who are leaving companies are looking to go to a company that actually puts things into prod, because too many ML specialists are just deeply frustrated in POC after POC after POC after POC that they can never actually get into production. And it's really interesting, because I see that a huge difference between the Asia Pac market, where we do about half of our recruiting, and the North American market, where we do the other half of our recruiting. North American companies have cracked this to a much greater extent. They are much better at getting things out of prod and out of experimentation and into prod. And the Aussies are catching up and saying, I don't want to work for another company that just makes me do POC and POC and POC. What do I think the challenge is? Agree with the things that Richard said, and it's just the fidelity of the data. Like, I would say half of the things that don't get out of POC fail because people who are very excited about the sprinkle on the top machine learning have never known or have forgotten that every good machine learning product is built on top of data. If you don't have good data to build it on top of, you are going to get stuck when you try to make something that doesn't need to be nursed along by individuals and can actually run at scale. So fidelity of the data underlying the things, if you don't already have nightmares about that, and you're beginning a fintech services product in this space, you should start to have nightmares about that. Take it from me, I've tried and failed and tried and failed, and now tried and succeeded to do this. And start worrying about the data much earlier than you think you need to. If you've got that one taped, and that really is a big one, I can't overstress it. I think one that crops up that people don't realize is change resistance, both inside your organization and with your customers. I heard a lovely anecdote the other day that said some people were trying to sell new sofas. They're trying to sell new sofas, and They made them cheaper and they made them better and they made more beautiful fabric and all the rest of it. And then when they really did some customer research, what they realized is the main thing that was stopping people from buying a new sofa was they didn't know how to get rid of their old one. And as soon as they helped the people get rid of their old sofa, suddenly all these people started buying sofas. And I think that's a really interesting analogy to hold in your head. There'll be change resistance to the new thing that you are trying to bring in that you haven't discovered yet. So fidelity of the data underlying your things and figuring out where you're going to get change resistance to the workflows you're changing. The third thing I'd add on top of that, because I think this is one that just catches development teams out again and again, a lot of folk who've been steeped in the software development industry have been taught from the very beginnings of their training, build loosely coupled systems. ML systems are inherently tightly coupled systems. That's one reason why they are much more expensive to build and why they are super fragile. But if you as a thinker, when you're thinking about the product that you want to build and the product you want to build and bring to market, if you are hung up on building your architecture in such a way that it is a loosely coupled system, you are probably going to tie yourself up into knots, because when you are learning patterns from data, which is inherently what almost all commercially useful machine learning algorithms do, they're supervised algorithms that learn patterns from data, that inherently makes them very tightly coupled. So you have to make a shift in your thinking about how you architect tightly coupled systems that are still practical to get out of the sandpit and into production. And I think that is another place where a lot of teams fall over, because they have non-software professionals building the prototypes, and then they try to hand that across to folk who have a lot of experience building enterprise software when they scale it. And there's a fundamental miscommunication between those two groups of folk. So there you go. Those are three things that I would ponder if you were trying to ponder, why can I not get my stuff out of POC and into prod?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And that data point that you mentioned, I've heard that so many times as well. Like it's very important to have that good data there. And I think another thing is that it's also important to, and this is a bit separate, but to consider those ethical considerations and the aspects as well that need to be taken into account, because that can actually be quite a challenge, especially as the financial services industry has such a vast volume of data as well. So maybe Kendra, I might start with you, just with the ethical considerations. So what sort of ethical considerations do you think it's important to think about when you're adopting machine learning into the workflow of the industry?
Yeah, this is something that we have thought about a lot. In my previous life, we certainly have, but at Xero, it's a real company focus. So I'll put in one tiny plug for Xero. Xero has recently actually become really vocal around responsible data use. And if you're interested in this stuff, you can go and see our thinking, because it's public. It's on our website. It's our approach to responsible data use is there. What it is, to give you a sneak preview, is a very principles-based approach. So what we've found when we've worked on this is there is no way that you can write down a comprehensive list of these are all the things that you should consider. And if you do, then your product will be ethical. It's just impossible to do that when you work in a really broad space. So instead, we flipped it around and effectively said, well, these are the principles that we want all of our products always to meet. And if I boil that down even further, and I could only give you one sentence, I would say always start with the front page test. If you actually had to explain how your product works and you weren't allowed to obfuscate and all the rest of it, would you be comfortable having that on the front page of the newspaper? Or, as you know, would you be comfortable explaining it to your parents? That, I think, if you start there, it is a brilliant place to start in terms of, oh, well, what are all the things that I should think about? I also go with the truism of just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think that technology and the availability of data, the amount of wearables we all wear, how very trackable our digital lives are putting a lot of things within our reach, that if you really do need teams to be super comfortable and empowered to say, hang on, I could do it. Should I do it? And then the third thing, perhaps I would say, in terms of things to really consider, is I think a lot of teams have fallen into the trap over the last 3 or 4 years, when this has become much more front of mind, but not something we're all super good at yet, is they go, I'll figure that out once I've built the product. And then I've seen a lot of teams fall into the trap of going, cool, so is your product fair? This new service that we're about to launch, is it unbiased? And then if the teams are smart, they come reasonably quickly to the thing and they go, oh, shit, sorry. I'm not sure, because what's fair? And what you find is there's no fair world benchmark to benchmark them against. And that's apart from the fact that you should, if you know better, you should do better. That's the main reason why I'd say front load your thinking about what an ethical service looks like before you start. Because if you come to the end and then try to prove that you have built an unbiased product, you will almost certainly find it's impossible, because it will be in comparison to what? Because the human services that we might be looking to augment or replace have their own inherent biases built in. So experience has taught me over the last 5 years, as trite as it sounds, start with that front page test. Start with if I had to explain this on the front page of the newspaper or to my mum, would I feel comfortable explaining how my product works? And if you don't, then that's probably a pretty good indication to go back and say, hey, just because I can doesn't mean I should.
Yeah, I love that front page test point that you made, and that's really important. Richard, anything on your end on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of factors here that I think are very important. Ethics in AI will be legislated. It's not a conversation of if, it will happen. So that's the first. That's the first thing, and it's a significant. Consideration. What the Europeans did as an example with their privacy laws, the same thing will happen with AI. So that's the first consideration. I think you can categorize this in my view, and I like that example that Kendra gave. I think you can categorize the ethics around AI, and particularly in financial services, around behaviors. Does it assist and drive the right behaviors? Okay, because that has proven itself over the last while to have presented a significant issue. Is it legal? That's from a compliance perspective, and then just from responsibilities perspective, and then does it meet shareholder expectations? Because there are a number of factors that we've seen as live examples. I'm going to go through one in a second, and it lends itself to the point that Kendra made, which is around just because you can doesn't mean it's right. So if you look at with clients in terms of hardship or delinquency, preferential product positioning, lending criteria, adversely targeting, reporting, all those sorts of things that can come into it. There's examples over the years where you talk about products that have been peddled by probably not mainstream banks, but probably second and third tier. And the term in financial services called trick finance, where you have significant interest charges to the client, and you take a factor that you're going to have a part of your book, call it your book, is going to go delinquent, but you're making so much money out of the balance of the book it doesn't matter. And I think this comes down to the benefit of ethics in AI. It always comes down to the person that's sitting on the end of the keyboard that actually gives you the power out of your AI. It doesn't come down to the machine actually making a decision. There's always someone that's programming. There's always someone that's setting the criteria, and there's always someone that actually establishes the process of automation to start with. So I sort of look at it and go, ethics is going to be a significant part. If you look at our organisation, we've embarked on an education campaign with all of our data scientists, with all our developers. If you look at it in terms of what our customers are expecting, ethics is a huge part of it, and particularly with the governments that we deal with that are regulating in the financial services environment, it will become law. So that's kind of what we are seeing in the market.
I think I agree with what Richard said, and then one positive spin I would put on it is we've been out in market talking to customers and clients and industry exec a lot, and this is the differentiator. So interestingly enough, I think we've come through that hump when potentially some folk might look at being ethical as another thing we have to do. I agree it's going to become regulated. I don't know how much that is going to help, because regulation is very hard to understand. It is very, very hard to write in a way that can encompass an entire industry and be usefully directive to a team. And I think it is going to become a differentiator for both investors and clients. So I think that's a beautiful positive spin to put on it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And also, hey, actually, if you're in for the long haul, it's becoming a reason that people pick you and might take their business to you. So that's something also I'd suggest to teams when they're thinking about the overhead of thinking ethically, is maybe think of it actually as a positive value add, not an overhead, and it changes the way you sort of think about that and put it into your product development.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everyone is starting to think about that. And as you said, just even with investors, so for example, startups, they need to start considering that early, because investors actually look into that too, whether you're taking into account those ethical considerations. So I think those are really great points that you both had made there, and it's important to think about that early. So Kendra, how can financial service organizations ensure that they become AI first?
I am going to start to sound like a broken record now, but I think it's worth repeating. For me, if I was advising a company on how to become AI first, or indeed when I'm doing that at Xero, the first thing I say is pay extraordinary amounts of attention to your data. Pay attention to its quality, pay attention to how you are stewarding it, pay attention to the coherence of the data. And what I mean by coherence, I mean, if Kendra does something over here in this part of your product set, and Kendra does something over here in this part of the product set, can you tell it's the same Kendra? If you haven't, you don't have high coherence data. And if you haven't got coherence data, you can't build beautiful, intuitive machine learning experiences. So pay attention. One way that I see that being framed now in the sort of, particularly coming out of the perhaps slightly more advanced North American market, slightly more advanced in their thinking on this, is I see people starting to pay much more attention and talk much more about the concept of a data product and a data product manager. Now, product managers might be something you do or do not have in your organization. The title is not important. The important thing is that they are a person, or a mindset, perhaps more importantly, of, sure, you build your customer-facing product, and that is super important, and we've all paid a lot of attention to that for a long time. But you also create a data product. 15 years ago in the warehousing and BI industry, this used to be called data exhaust. We call it digital breadcrumbs, or those sorts of things. I'm really liking the trend I'm seeing of companies calling it a data product and saying, if you're building for scale, if you're building for a big, interesting, rich product set, you need to be paying as much attention and caring as much about the data product that your front end product is capturing as you do to the front end experience. Because if you want to be able to build these beautiful, coherent, tied together experiences across your product set, that is what is the key to make or break that. To give an example, to make it a little bit more tangible, if anyone on this call is a user of the Google Suite, you will be familiar with the fact that things that you do in Mail pops up in things that you do in Maps. Calendar invites that you have here will pop up in things that tell you how long it will take you to get to your next meeting. Google pays a lot of attention to data coherence and entity coherence across its product set, and it shows in the fact that its products know who Kendra is in every different part of how I pay attention to them. I think it's really interesting. You may or may not like the tactics that different big companies use to do that, but if you dig a little deeper and pay attention to why they're doing it, I think that can inform a lot about how you can transition to thinking in an AI first way, because that's the most important part of becoming AI first. You can't just go, cool, I am going to become an AI first company. The first thing you have to do is shift your thinking and start thinking AI first. The very first step in that is becoming a literate company. So becoming a data literate company. And this is another one that I'm just super passionate about, because I think it makes a big difference to people's employability and people's longevity in their careers. We're used to the idea of being literate in being able to read. We're used to the idea of people being numerate. I think it's really important now for sort of people who want to work in this space to raise the data literacy of their companies, because to become AI first in your thinking, you first need to have the vocabulary to do that. And that to me is data literacy. So there you go. That's a very long answer to your question, but I hope that just gives people some things to think about.
No, and I think that's a great answer to the question as well. Richard, I'll pass it over to you as well to get your thoughts on it too.
I think to Kendra's point, we assume a position of data literacy, and I think that's a really, I think it's a really good point. And when I say that, as professionals in this industry, we just get out there and say, why can't you just do this? And it's not that hard. It's those sorts of things. And when the capability isn't there, or when and I'm probably going to walk through a bit of a story flow to this, but it's understanding the data and its value is the critical piece, and getting executive, getting non-IT folk and non-IT literate folk, as part of that transformation, because all they see is an enormous amount of. You go to a board member, they just get out there and say of a major bank, they just see billions of dollars going out the door every year on the cost of managing customer systems and core banking systems. And so if you actually have a look at it, it kind of segues nicely into the three things for me around AI and what it does for financial services is around, and the important pieces around it, and how do they become AI first. So the first one is customer, because what happens a lot of the time with banks is that the customer is not necessarily the first. I'll be very polite about it, but the customer necessarily is not always the first consideration when it comes to systems, when it comes to that experience piece. And there are services that a bank can deliver by knowing their data for a customer, which becomes intuitive, right? So call it advisory, call it assistive, whatever that's going to be. But if you see a flow, a bank should be able to assist with a customer, and not to intervene, but to just get out there and say, we can assist you here. Messages out there, taking proactive channel, looking at the differences that the bank can impact for a customer. It doesn't happen at the moment because core banking systems aren't structured that way. Core banking systems are around institutional payments, whatever that's going to be. It's not about the customer experience, and that's going to be a huge piece and a huge step forward that you're going to see from some of the up and coming banks that you see. And there's a number of them that are in the marketplace. They're very well financed, and they're changing the way that the top 4 or 5 are actually approaching their customers. So that's the first thing. Budget. It's an expensive thing to do, and I agree with one of Kendra's earlier points. It's like AI is not a cheap. Is not a cheap throwaway, and it's not the system, it's not the people, it's not about that. It's about the legacy and moving 50 years of legacy into new process, into compliance, into regulation, all those sorts of things. So budget is key, but prioritizing that budget again for that new outcome and for that new experience, again, I think that's probably one of the first adoption pieces that you could look at. And the last thing is, and it's a difficult thing, is around capability. The capability around this doesn't necessarily come from having a building full of consultants that are coming in and telling you, looking at your watch and saying, "Can I borrow that?" And then you're asking them to tell you the time. It doesn't come down to that. They've got to have capability that's inherent to their business process and inherent to their business flow, and that needs to be, I think, first and foremost, part of the education process, part of the approval process, and part of the value process of implementation of AI. Because again, it's not a cheap thing. It's not a cheap thing to do, but it is extremely of high impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think great point there. It's high impact. The impact that it will have on the organization is great. So it's really important to even think about that. And you're both in the AI side of things, you're working in that space. So what are the biggest changes that you've seen in the financial service industry that has actually been brought about by AI and machine learning? And Kendra, might start off with you and getting your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's one big thematic thing that I believe started before I arrived on this sort of in this space and started thinking about it. It's present today, and I think that it's pushing. It'll be one of the things that will be really differentiating in the future. It's funny. It's to transact when convenient. So, back when I was a little girl, you had a passbook, and you went to the bank with your passbook if you wanted to deposit money. Can any of us imagine having to do that today? That's extraordinary, and something I think we're still semi okay with today is the concept of the bank's closed at X o'clock. Mm-hmm. It's one of the only areas of sort of my day-to-day life where I still have to worry about that. I still have to worry about, is it within business hours or not? So I think that that is where AI and ML, and particularly fin services, can reach in and say, hang on, this is a convention that comes from things that we've left behind. Actually, obviously for me, I think a lot about small business owners. Small business owners don't work to a timetable. They don't work to an open or shut. And increasingly, because we're used to not having to do that in other areas of our lives, we don't necessarily work 9 to 5 either. A lot of us can have that flexibility now with working from home, work when it's convenient, work when it works for us, work in the middle of the night if that's when your ideas flow. I think machine learning has got can be applied to take time constraints away from financial services, to say, when you are ready to do this, then you can do it. You don't have to be synced up with another human. It doesn't have to be in real time. We can pick the process to pieces and put it back together again so that as much as possible of it can be done when you want it. So transact where convenient, I think, is just a really interesting thematic way that I think the industry will continue to move. And I think it will be a little bit of that pebble that starts the avalanche. Just like we couldn't imagine today needing to take a passbook into a branch. And, you know, my grandmother wouldn't have been able to imagine being able to pick up her mobile phone and move money around on her mobile phone. A push towards continuing to make it transact whenever I want to is going to change that industry more than we can possibly imagine, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Richard, your thoughts on it as well, your perspective for it.
I think there's a really good point here, and it goes back to your first question, which is around giving the customer the ability to be able to access systems without having to have high-touch individuals. And I'll give you an example here. A number of years ago, I was traveling in the United States and turned up to the hotel. Booked my car first. It was a brand new credit card. Booked my car. It went through, no problems at all. Checked into the hotel, and things seemed to go through. It was okay. And then I got a call from the hotel manager saying, "Can you come down, please? Because your credit card's been rejected." So I was like, "Oh, okay, no problems at all." So I called my bank, and I got an automated message, and you're going to have to call back between 8 and 6. And on daytime in the United States without any access to whatever. And thankfully, I have a good relationship with other banks, and was not left high and dry. But when you take that to modern day experience, and you start to see, what does this mean for a customer? Right? I don't need to speak to an operator to be able to say, I'm traveling in the United States. You can validate me. You can do a number of point checks on my identity. Just turn my card back on, or do whatever, give you the experience, however that's going to look. But that can be done via AI, and that can be done simply via AI, but you've got to be able to adapt with your systems and invest in those systems to be able to do it. So that's the first thing. So that's the digitization piece around the customer experience. I think that flexibility, I think the security components to it, these are all inherent features that come out of that exceptional experience for customers that comes out of this. And it's a really soft benefit that's high impact. And I think what happens is that getting institutions to get their head around, what does it mean from, it's not about modernization. It's not about the interface. It comes down to that all important piece as far as, as the experience goes through, validate me, make it safe, make sure I'm assured, and don't give me a surprise. And AI has that. I think that's the intrinsic value of AI, because you take that interventionist piece out of it. You can actually have a significant impact with just bringing outcome for the client. I think that's kind of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one final question, and you both actually touched on this, is what do you see the future for the financial services industry being with incorporating AI and ML? And Kendra, I might start off with you.
Here's me looping back to a point that Richard made right at the beginning. For me, again, trying to answer that in a broad fashion, I think the future of financial services and where ML will be most useful is an augmentation of humans. And to go back to Richard's point at the beginning, I agree with him. I don't think it's replacement of humans. Maybe it is in 30 years, but that's a long time future. In the 5 to 10 year future, I think it's augmentation of humans, and it's taking those folk who humans are not great at paying rigorous attention to a boring task. Machines are very good at that. So how can we figure out those places where we can concentrate the human skill into the areas that humans are good at and machines are poor at, and fill in for the bits that humans can do, but fatigue in with machines, which are usually custom designed for that purpose. So that's sort of, for me, from a customer perspective or from a product development perspective, what I think the future is. If I flip it around and say, what do I think the future of AI services inside an organization is? All those things, as you know, that we just said. But another tip I would suggest is that I think the future of it is very, very careful consideration of where to apply it. So something we haven't touched on really at all in this conversation, we've mentioned it's expensive. There's software systems that are hard to build, expensive to maintain. They're also expensive because folk are expensive in this space. And particularly today, and I'd say in the next 5 years, folk who have the depth of experience building products into production and products that scale are very rare. So if you have a massive checkbook, maybe you can afford them. But even then, you are simply going to run into the limits of there aren't a whole lot of folk with those skills around, and we can and should grow them. And I love the fact that some companies in Australia and New Zealand are leaning into growing them. But I still think that a good place to pay really attention is, where will you apply it? And to give you an example of how we think about that at Xero, we have an industry which is ripe for augmentation of humans. It's ripe for automation. There's a lot of manual work, intellectually manual work in accounting and bookkeeping. And we are very excited, and our customers are excited for us to remove that manual toil. But we have so many opportunities of things that you could do in the space that we have to be really careful about where we apply our folks. And so one way we've thought about it is we really only want to build a product which can have at least 3 applications. So we think about it as domains of AI inside our space, and we've actually poured a lot of time and careful consideration into what should those domains be. And we do that because people are rare, the systems are hard, and we want to say, how do you get the most bang for your buck? So from a customer perspective, I think it's augmentation of humans, product development, all the rest of it, augmentation of humans, flipping it around from a people, sort of a making the most of your rare people inside an org. I think it is thinking hard about multi-use applications and building to multi-headed customer products inside your AI team. And how do you do all of those things? Hey, it's back to my original point. Literacy, literacy, literacy. To become AI first, push on literacy and think really hard about where you apply it.
Yeah, that's great. And Richard, I see that you're agreeing again. We've also got some questions, so I might ask your response on this, and then we'll go to these questions that are coming through as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces to this. I think fintechs at the moment are good or bad, whatever, being product specific, being service specific. What I'd like to see is bureau type services and value services to the bank. So if you actually have a look at it, in terms of a number of these discussion points that we've discussed today have been around point solutions or point implementations. Let's talk about let's talk about a payment, or let's talk about FX, or let's talk about whatever. I'd like to see that, and I like Kendrell's analogy there as far as trying to create a bureau for a bank that basically says, I don't need to transform, I don't need to do this, I'm just going to enable my data, and that I can potentially partner with an organization to assist with the delivery of that service. And I think it's kind of using the power of AI in the back end that's around that, but with the fintech, partnering with the financial services group to actually deliver that new outcome. So I think that's, so what happens then is you see the emergence of some of the tech in the space around deep learning and neural networks and those type of factors that come into it. But that really is looking at the next generation and where I think we're going to land.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so that's the conversation for us. And thank you both so much for that insightful conversation. What we'll do is we'll move on to these questions. So everyone, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat, and we can go through each of these. So one of the questions that we've got is, what if we considered using AI not as an augmenting capacity or apps, but as an ideation/discovery capacity, creating features, hypothesis, ? Have the panel members explored this? Can it open new areas to explore? Kendra, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, so whoever asked it, forgive me if I go off on the wrong tack. The short answer is no, I don't think so. But the longer answer is ideas are not the problem. And I probably have banged on this drum until you guys are all sick of it. But honestly, ideas are not the problem. There are so many smart people in fintechs and so many smart people associated with FSI, and they're all very quantitative. If I had a team that was 10 times the size, 100 times the size of the team I have today, we would keep them all busy. So I don't ever really worry about ideation and good ideas, because there's a saying that our CEO likes to say a lot: ideas are cheap, execution is everything, that he stole from the guy from Intel. And we say it to make a point, but yeah, ideas are not what we lack. It's how you turn those ideas into beautiful products. So that's probably why I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking in that space.
Yeah, great. Richard, did you want to add to that one as well?
Yeah, I think what we've seen, we're an AI specialist organisation, so I think from our perspective, we've seen a lot of proof of concept work, and that's to touch on Kendra's point from before of part of the resourcing challenge. There are so many ideas that get presented around this, and I think with Agile now, failing fast and turning things off fast is what it's all about. But you spend an enormous amount of time in experimentation around these things. Look, I think invariably, is it an augmentation to capability and capacity? Absolutely. But and I think this is the challenge that we spoke about earlier. Is that the highest priority for the bank? Is that the highest priority for their budget? Is experimentation where it actually lies? Or is it around the actual capability, and is it around the actual experience? So I look at it and say, I would agree with the position that it can be used. It probably should be used, but is it the priority? And that's really what it comes down to. And I think to Kendra's point, it's around the education of people around their data and around the value of their data is where we land on that. So yes, not yet.
We hope we answered that question for you. Another one that has come through is, just as Australia is a financial services buy now, pay later world leader, do you think Australia has potential area of machine learning specialization? Richard or Kendra?
I'm happy to grab this one first, if that's all right. We saw around about 10 years, I'm going to talk about security first if I can, that Australia lagged the world in security capability, where, as recently as sort of 5-7 years ago, we didn't make the top 50 in terms of security capability in the world. Now, I think what's happened here is that government has kind of learned from that mistake and then looking around corners. So there's investment that's going into AI. There's investment that's going into the capability. There's investment that's going into the education system. There's encouragement, in terms of legislation, and in terms of driving students into STEM. Looking at the type of resourcing that we're going to need as a capability, because it's not just about having a machine to do this. It's about having the smart person that sits on the end of the machine capable of actually delivering this. So do we have the ability to be a leader in this? I think government sees it. I think the government needs to invest more in it. I think they absolutely would. But it comes down to how are they going to get the traction, and what is going to be the best bang for buck out of that investment. So do we have the ability to do it? In a sentence, yes. Are we there yet? There are a number of companies that are in front of us, that's for sure.
So I would say let's dream. So I would love to see Asia Pac, Australia, New Zealand, this part of the world become a political area, perhaps, or a section of the world that specializes in ethical AI development. I think we've actually got some things working for us in that respect, in terms of relatively stable, not too polarized politics. Folk who are sort of based in that, have a fair go, kind of steeped in that perhaps sort of colloquial culture. And also perhaps that's a place where you've got to turn into an advantage the fact that you perhaps haven't been a first mover. Because you haven't been a first mover, you can look at some of the countries and geographic areas that have, and say, well, what might we choose to do a little differently? And I think one space you could say is, well, let's choose to really invest in creating an environment in which it would be unthinkable not to build a responsible product, not to build an ethical product. Let's get good at bringing human interaction designers and legal specialists and ethicists into conversations early. And let's be the area of the world that says, well, that's how you do things here. You build responsible AI products. I think that could bring investment into the country from our perspective, but that is a differentiator now for companies and for investors. And I think it could bring talent into the country, because you are seeing now a fairly vocal section of the ML community who says, I'm uncomfortable with the ethics of the company that I am working within. And there's been some, very high profile public resignations when folk have specifically said that the reason they are resigning from particular companies is the disrespect or the sort of unfeeling thinking around ethical considerations and product sets. So, hey, let's turn that into our advantage, and maybe we should have a specialization in ethical product development.
Could I make one more point, please, Cash, if that's all right?
Go for it.
One of the very good experiences that we've had in dealing with BOAB as an investor in PI Exchange is that there's been a lot of close collaboration and a lot of work done from the funds with us. So, Artisan and also BOAB in their involvement with us, but also the connections that they've been able to create for us with government, with introductions to business and all the rest of it. So these are the sorts of things as a startup that have significant impact. It makes it so much easier to go in with with that live introduction and that live connection. I think it also the assistance that's provided by the funds and the power of a fund in actually being able to speak with lawmakers and to be able to have that engagement to see what's driving your business, how are we actually delivering against what you'd like to see from a capability perspective, but how are we going to fund it? How are we actually going to land there? So I think the funds have got a lot to do that. So I think as a plug for BOAB, they've been very good and been very generous with us in that introduction and what we've seen as well. Sorry, ad over.
Didn't pay him to say that either. And we might just go through one last question. What are your favorite applications of AI in financial services currently, and what are your least favorites? Kendra.
Sound like a product plug, and it completely isn't, because I honestly don't know who builds this product, but I should, because I've used it for a long time. I really like Pocketbook. So I've used it for a really long time, way back when I'm well aware that I was the product, because I wasn't paying for the product. And I do see them now sort of dabbling in the spaces of trying to monetize it. But it plays to my detail-oriented heart. I love the fact that it really does provide me with a flexible, useful way to do budgeting. So there you go. I think Pocketbook, I don't know what their monetization strategy is, but I think they deserve to have one, because I think they've put a product in place that is actually really interesting and really useful. I've seen budgeting applications, banks attempt to build that into their space. They don't focus on it, and you can tell. And I think it's fascinating to see a product where, as far as I can tell, as a completely unadvised observer, it was a genuine, deep focus. And only later did they bring monetization to it. So, yep, there you go. I reckon go and give those guys a spin.
Amazing. And Richard, what are yours?
Favorite products in this space. I mean, I do a lot of project work and get involved in a lot of project work. So for that, turning on that moment for a client when they see a significant impact. So for me, and I sort of look at it around. I quite like the AML space, and there are some really interesting functions where an executive may look at delivering a service and having a resource with a team that's enormous and just doing commodity pieces. So getting involved in those type of things and actually having that impact in the back end, I really I sort of see the impact of that on a business, and I see the change that makes to a business, and that kind of, that for me is what AI is about, right? It's not about looking at something and saying I'm just going to go and replace people. You're not, because there's going to be other roles, there's going to be other functions, there's going to be other importance for that to do. I think for us, what we see is when you get that impact and when you deploy that application and when you've actually built that model and you see the actual value and the customer sees it, that's that is really the exciting piece for me. So there's really nothing specific around it that I can say, oh, it's this particular product, it's this one off the shelf and all the rest of it, because we see and touch this every day, how we travel, how we eat, how we experience, how we do whatever. But I sort of look at it and go, from a client perspective, when you see the client experience change, that's the big thing for me.
Fantastic. Amazing. Well, thank you. That's a wrap. Really appreciate you, Kendra and Richard, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for jumping on as well and listening. And we hope that we provide some insight into what's happening in the industry and how we can actually utilize and incorporate machine learning. So thank you again. We will be running more similar events in the coming weeks. So stay tuned, follow us on LinkedIn, and you'll find out more. Thank you again, Richard and Kendra. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thanks, Cash. Thanks, Kendra.
It was a great conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Great. See you later. Bye.